Everyone thought the story ended on August 9th, 1995. Jerry Garcia dies, the Grateful Dead stop touring, and that's it. Another 60s band that couldn't survive losing its center. The parking lot scene fades into memory, the Tapers pack up their gear, and all those endless variations of Dark Star become archival material for people who were there. Only that's not what happened. The surviving members didn't just try to keep playing the songs, they tried to recreate the actual conditions that made the Grateful Dead possible in the first place. The risk, the improvisation, young musicians learning from old musicians, the willingness to completely bomb in front of a paying audience, that whole thing. And Phil Lesh, the guy who played bass for 30 years in a band that literally never stayed in one place, decided he was going to give his roaming culture a permanent home. After Jerry died, the remaining members spent years trying different approaches. The other ones in 1998, 2000, and 2002. The Dead in 2003, 2004, and 2009. Different lineups, different configurations, trying to figure out what this could be without Jerry at the center. Then in September 2009, Phil and Bob Weir formed Further. Long psychedelic jams, obscure songs from the catalog that hadn't been played in years. The kind of risks the Dead used to take in 1968 when nobody knew if the audience would stay or walk out. Further lasted until November 2014, when Phil and Bob headed in different directions. Bob would go on to form Dead & Company with Mickey Hart, Bill Kreutzmann, John Mayer. 3 of the original 5 members at formation were still playing together, still touring, still filling stadiums. Phil went the other way. March 2012, while Further was still going, Phil and his wife Jill opened Terrapin Crossroads in San Rafael. Not a venue they were renting, a place they owned, what Phil called his sandbox. He told Marin magazine, "We tried to do this in the 60s and in the 80s, but we could never find the right place. With Terrapin Crossroads and Sweetwater, we finally have it." Finally have what? A home for something that never had one. Jill described it as multi-generational. The parents bring their kids, and the kids bring their parents. A place where up-and-coming musicians could play with people who'd been doing this since 1967. Where the whole collaborative, experimental thing could keep happening without the grind of constant touring. For almost 10 years, it actually worked. The venue had 2 spaces, the restaurant and bar up front, where you could grab food and hang out before a show. Then, the great room in back. This intimate performance space, maybe 150 people capacity, where Phil would play 4 or 5 nights a week, some weeks more. The whole setup was designed around one idea: make it easy for musicians to show up, plug in, and see what happens. Ezra Lipp, one of the musicians who played there regularly, said 40 or so musicians would collaborate on any given night. And he wasn't exaggerating. Phil Lesh and Friends wasn't a fixed band. It was whoever Phil invited that week. Sometimes it was his sons Grahame and Brian on guitar and drums. Sometimes it was Warren Haynes or John Scofield. November 30th, 2012, one of the early shows. Crazy Fingers and back out. Then Loose Lucy into Sissy Strut. The kind of set list that made no sense on paper but worked because everyone in that room was listening to each other, taking risks, following wherever the music went. That was the whole point. Phil told Marin magazine he'd never been happier than playing at Terrapin Crossroads, and you can understand why. After decades of massive tours and production schedules and all the logistical nightmares of being in the Grateful Dead, there was this small room where he could just play music with people he wanted to play with. No touring, no buses, no pressure to recreate the past. Just show up and make something new. October 2013, Phil made it official. "I'm off the bus. I'll be sticking to shows at my San Rafael, California venue, Terrapin Crossroads, as well as various residencies around the country." Off the bus. At 73 years old, Phil Lesh was done with the road. He'd found his spot. May 18th, 2021, one of the last Phil Lesh and Friends shows at the venue. Bob Weir sat in. They played Scarlet Begonias into Cold Rain and Snow, into Me and Bobby McGee. Then Bob joined for Viola Lee Blues. That version of Viola Lee, There were sections around the 30-minute mark and again around 2 hours and 45 minutes in where you can hear what Terrapin Crossroads was supposed to be. Two guys who'd been playing together since 1965, still finding new spaces and songs they'd played 1,000 times, because the room was small enough and intimate enough that they could actually hear each other think. The house bands rotated too. Grahame Lesh's band Midnight North played there regularly. Other local groups would open or fill in on nights when Phil wasn't playing. Young musicians who grew up listening to Dead bootlegs were suddenly on stage with the guy who wrote Box of Rain with lyricist Robert Hunter, learning not by studying the music, but by playing it with someone who'd been there from the beginning. Phil described it as a meeting place of minds, ideas, people. But it was more specific than that. It was a place where the thing that made the Grateful Dead work, that collaborative, improvisational, risk-taking approach, could be passed directly from one generation to the next. Not through tribute acts or museum pieces, but through the actual act of playing together. Jill Lesh said people would thank them for building Terrapin Crossroads, called it a home away from home, a community center where you can see your favorite up-and-coming musicians. And that multi-generational thing she talked about actually happened. Parents who'd followed the Dead in the 70s and 80s brought their kids. Those kids grew up watching Grahame and Brian play, watching their dad play with legends, understanding that this music wasn't something you preserved, it was something you participated in. The musicians who played there regularly talk about it like it was this unique thing, not just because Phil Lesh owned it, but because of how it operated. Most venues book acts months in advance. Terrapin Crossroads would sometimes finalize lineups a week out, sometimes days. The whole point was spontaneity. Who's in town? Who wants to play? What happens if we put these people together? And financially, it was always precarious. Running a venue is expensive. Paying 40 musicians to collaborate on a given night doesn't make business sense. The restaurant helped subsidize the music side, but it was never going to be a moneymaker. Phil and Jill weren't trying to turn a profit. They were trying to create the conditions for something valuable to happen. For almost a decade, it did. But Phil wasn't trying to preserve the Grateful Dead. He was trying to recreate the environment that produced them. Think about how the Dead actually formed. Young musicians in the Bay Area in the mid-60s, playing bluegrass and folk, getting weird, influenced by jazz and Indian classical music and whatever Coltrane was doing that week. They'd jam for hours, fail constantly, occasionally stumble into something transcendent. The whole thing was built on risk and collaboration and looking stupid in public half the time. That's what Phil wanted at Terrapin Crossroads, not a museum, a place where that energy could happen again, where a 73-year-old bassist could invite a jazz guitarist to reinterpret Scarlet Begonias and just see what happened, where his sons could learn the same way he'd learned, by playing with people better than them, by failing in front of an audience, by taking risks and discovering what worked. But there's a problem with trying to anchor something that only works when it's moving. The Grateful Dead's culture was nomadic by design. Shakedown Street moved parking lot to parking lot. Tapers followed the tour, trading soundboards, documenting every show. The set list changed every night. Dark Star in 1969 sounded nothing like Dark Star in 1974, which sounded nothing like Dark Star in 1989. The whole thing only worked because it never stayed still. Terrapin Crossroads tried anyway, and artistically it succeeded. Those collaborations happened, the music was real. People brought their kids, and those kids learned to dance to Uncle John's band in the same room where their parents danced. The multi-generational vision materialized. The passing of knowledge from Phil to Grahame to younger musicians actually occurred. But economically, it was always fragile. Then, March 2020 hits. COVID shuts down live music everywhere. Terrapin Crossroads goes dark. The Lesh family's lease expires, a sale falls through, and November 2021, the venue closes permanently. Ezra Lipp said it would leave a hole that will be hard to fill, because this wasn't just a venue closing. This was Phil Lesh's decade-long experiment in giving Dead culture a fixed address. June 27th and 28th, and July 3rd through the 5th, 2015. Fare thee well. The 4 surviving core members reunited: Phil, Bob, Mickey, Bill. Levi's Stadium in Santa Clara, then 3 nights at Soldier Field in Chicago. Trey Anastasio from Fish on guitar, filling the impossible role. During Terrapin Station on July 5th, something happened in that crowd. Not just, "we're saying goodbye," but "this thing is bigger than the 5 guys who started it." By fall 2015, Dead & Company had formed. Bob, Mickey, Bill, plus John Mayer, Oteil Burbridge, Jeff Chimenti. They've been touring ever since. The 2023 tour sold 845,000 tickets, grossed nearly $115 million. So the culture was thriving, growing, not shrinking, but always in motion, city to city, venue to venue, never settling. And Phil was in San Rafael trying to make the opposite thing work. The Grateful Dead succeeded by accident. They stumbled into the hate street scene, stumbled into the acid tests, stumbled into a touring model that created its own culture. Shakedown Street wasn't planned. The taper section wasn't designed. The whole thing emerged organically because the conditions were right. Terrapin Crossroads was an attempt to engineer those conditions deliberately. Phil and Jill sat down and said, "What if we build a place where this could happen on purpose?" Can't blame them for trying. After 30 years on the road, after losing Jerry, after watching the scene scatter and reform and scatter again, why wouldn't you want to build something permanent? Something your kids could run. Something that didn't depend on sold-out tours and buses and the endless grind. But even when the music stays good, and at Terrapin Crossroads it did, something about the predictability works against you. You know Phil's playing Tuesday and Thursday. You know the house band rotates on a pattern. The risk becomes routine. The spontaneity gets scheduled. Dead culture thrives when there's actual uncertainty, where you don't know if tonight's Dark Star will be transcendent or train wreck, when the whole thing could collapse but keeps going anyway. A permanent venue, no matter how well-intentioned, can't sustain that forever. Phil Lesh died October 25, 2024, 84 years old. His son Grahame, who'd played in the Terrapin Crossroads house bands, who'd absorbed all those lessons about collaboration and risk and keeping the music moving, organized the Terrapin Road Show. Not a venue, not a permanent home, a tour, a traveling celebration of everything his father tried to build, except this time they put it back on the road where it belonged. The Terrapin Road Show in 2025 proved something. The community didn't need Terrapin Crossroads, the building. They needed the spirit. And that spirit could travel, could adapt, could continue in parking lots and theaters and wherever people gathered to play the music and take the risks. Pop Matters called it a revival of the near-utopian spirit of the original venue. That utopian spirit, that's what Phil was chasing. Not the real estate, not the business model. The feeling of a place where musicians and fans and families could gather and the music could evolve in real time. Turns out, you don't need a building for that. You need people willing to keep it moving. Phil Lesh spent 10 years trying to give his culture a home. The venue closed, the lease expired, the pandemic hit. The economics didn't work. But the generation that came up through Terrapin Crossroads, the musicians who played those 40-person collaborative nights, who'd learned from Phil, who absorbed the whole thing, they're carrying it forward now. Not by preserving it, by letting it move. The 4 core members played together for the last time in July 2015. Dead & Company kept touring with 3 of them. Phil opened Terrapin Crossroads, declared he was off the bus, tried to build Permanence. It lasted 9 years, produced incredible music, fostered community, gave 40 musicians a place to collaborate. Then it closed. Grahame Lesh took the Terrapin Road Show on the road in 2025, a few months after his father died. The culture passes forward not through real estate or business plans, but through people who understand the music only works when it's willing to fail, willing to risk, willing to move. Terrapin Crossroads doesn't exist anymore. Can't visit it, can't buy a ticket, can't experience those collaborative nights. But the spirit's still moving, still evolving, still refusing to be preserved. Phil Lesh was right about one thing. It is a meeting of minds, ideas, people. He just had the location wrong. It's not in San Rafael. It's not in any building. It's wherever people gather to take the risks and make the music and trust the next generation keeps it rolling. The bus doesn't park. Never did.